Prepare to experience the strongest radio allowable by law. Secrets will be revealed. Myths dispelled. From the studio gym where excuses never apply, it's Superhuman Radio with your host, Carl Lenore.
I want to apologize to the people watching the show. I guess I wore the wrong shirt today, and it looks like I'm a ghost. But anyway, don't let that distract you. It's all part of the trip. We have a fascinating show today. We're going to be talking about how psychedelics impact consciousness. And I love this kind of stuff. You know, we've been talking about this stuff for a very long time. And it's becoming more and more popular now, especially in therapeutic approaches that the people are studying, like we're going to talk about today. Before we get started, I have to thank my title sponsor, and that's Legendary Foods, makers of the Tasty Pastry. The Tasty Pastry started out as a solution to the Pop-Tart, but it's become so much more because you'll think you're really eating cake when you eat the Tasty Pastry. The flavors are amazing. 20 grams of high-quality protein, less than 1 gram of sugar. And for those of us who observe our carbohydrate intake, 4 to 5 net carbs. So it'll keep you in your lane if you're a low-carb or keto person. Go to shrnetwork.biz/legendary. Use the code SHR10 today and save 10% off, and let them know that you heard about them here on Superhuman Radio. Now, without further delay, my guest, Dr. Sandeep Nayak. Am I pronouncing your last name properly?
Yep, Nayak.
Nayak. Okay, great. Welcome to the show. Thanks for being here today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Carl.
So we're going to talk about your most recent research into the application of psychedelics and how it impacts consciousness. But what research preceded this that made this the next logical study to do?
So there's a lot of different threads that are kind of ongoing, but basically there's kind of two types of psychedelic research that go on. One is therapeutic and the other is not, everything else. But these are, of course, related, right? It's not a different drug when you're giving it to a patient. And so I think the big mystery that motivates me in this field is how do psychedelics help people change? And I mean, in a very, very broad sense, change in all kinds of ways, good, bad. And one of the more striking kinds of changes that you see that are really, really, they can really be enduring are changes to beliefs. And people can have beliefs that are therapeutically relevant. Oh, I'm a terrible person. Everything I do is doomed to fail. And people can also have obviously spiritual or philosophical beliefs. And all of these are kind of in play when it comes to psychedelics. So yeah, this is basically just broader context of belief changes after psychedelic use.
My audience already knows that I did a lot of LSD as a young man, and I continue to microdose, as many people like to call it. And one of the rules when I was a young guy was you don't trip if you are in a bad state of mind. Like if you just had a fight with your girlfriend, you don't go, oh, let's go out and do some LSD tonight, because whatever underlying emotion there is driving you at that moment in time, it's amplified by the LSD. Do you think that could have something to do with the fact of whether or not a hallucinogen or psychedelic will make the outcome good or bad? Like, in other words, you were just saying, some people have bad experiences when they have these, I want to call them trip, but these episodes, if you will. Some people come out with an invigorated feeling about life and everything that's possible, and other people come out and they're like freaked out and they're diagnosed now with, some sort of psychosis or something. Do you think it's the environment when you trip that plays a role in the trajectory of what you feel afterwards?
100%. This is one of the reasons why the earlier research at the very beginning, it was so confused. I mean, people were looking at it as oh, this is going to make you psychotic. We get to understand what schizophrenia is like. Others are using it in a spiritual sense. Others are using it in a recreational sense. All kinds of different contexts, and they produce very different experiences. So, for therapeutic use, it's not just that the drug alone is necessarily going to be helpful. There's got to be a whole therapeutic context around that with intentions that are going to be salutary. And I think the context is key.
So Joseph Lanigan is watching us on Facebook, and I want to take his question early now because it kind of plays into something else that you're working in, and that's the application of psychedelics to treat people with addiction. And Joseph says, I took acid 8 years ago and quit drinking. Haven't drank since, and I was basically an alcoholic. Is this common? And once again, does the context of the trip play a role in this? What could Joseph have been doing? Maybe in his mind he's wanted to stop drinking, and somehow the LSD triggered his ability to.
So I don't know his. I guess I'll say two things. One is that this is absolutely kind of an actively like a use case that we're looking at for psychedelics, namely addictions of all kinds: alcohol, tobacco, opioids. And why would a psychedelic experience help somebody quit alcohol, forever? There's actually a lot of reasons. And I don't know if whatever it was that happened with Joe in particular, but sometimes people have insights. They have realizations that, for example, alcohol does not. It's not. I'm not limited by. I'm bigger than alcohol. I'm bigger than my relationship to alcohol. It might realign your values. You might have psychological insights. You might feel a greater sense of connectedness with the people around you and want to, do better by them. It can be any number of things. So I think there's a variety of ways that it can pan out. And that's what we see in the studies too. It's like very variable for people.
So when you look at, let's stay with this concept of an addictive personality. Someone's addicted to something, and their trip kind of rids them of all desire of the substance that they've been abusing. Now, as you point out, they probably have had thoughts about quitting that substance. But do you think that there's something that occurs in the brain neurochemically that charges an idea with emotion, with the energetic emotion? Like anybody who's done LSD knows, first of all, the biggest complaint you have, assuming you have and may all your trips be good trips, that you have stiffness in your face from smiling and laughing for 2 days steady. Like this sensation to laugh it comes on its own. It has nothing to do with what you're looking at or anything. Do you think that when you have a thought like, I'd like to quit alcohol, and somehow this emotional energy charges it during the trip, that it becomes more of a blueprint as opposed to just a thought?
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. I use the word amplify. One of the hallmark features of psychedelic experiences, good or bad, is that they are meaningful. That seems to be kind of more common than like even the visual effects. And so it's why do people have all of these kind of cliched realizations, like things that they already knew, but they kind of believe it more now. People already know that, I don't know, for example, that they should quit or what have you, but it adds this kind of new life and force to these insights, or it provides meaning that's more stable, I think.
Yeah, there's that moment where you look up in the sky and the clouds are breaking open and you see these really big banded rays of sun coming out, and it reminds you of something mystical and magical and godly, just because of that image that you have. And some people will say, "Oh, it makes the hair on the back of my neck stand up." You have this. It's almost like LSD charges things with a mystical power that didn't exist in its absence.
Well, so I will say, and even with addiction, right? I mean, I actually, in my clinical work, I deal a lot with addiction, and this isn't something that I really knew about until I started asking people. But some people who, they try many, I'm thinking of one person in particular. I think the issue was cocaine. I forget, but many tries, and then one day they just stopped, and the person's description of what happened that day was that they had a spontaneous mystical experience. The person in particular was Christian, so it was kind of in that framework. But
right,
it's rare, but it's not unheard of. And actually, if you start asking people, I think it's probably a little more common than we might realize. But yeah, the psychedelic, obviously, that's much more a reliable way to engender those types of experiences.
So let's talk about your research particularly. This research, you looked at the effects on consciousness by just one, remarkable trip experience in a person, right? Describe how the study was designed.
So basically, this was part of a larger project looking at what types of beliefs change after psychedelics. So we surveyed like 1,600 people who had a psychedelic experience that they reported in some way changed one or more of some of their beliefs. We kind of worded that very vaguely, intentionally. And then we wanted to see, I mean, what are there kind of clear trends? Are there clear themes? Are there certain directions that beliefs tend to change? And in this particular study, what we showed was that people whose beliefs do change tends to be that they attribute conscious awareness to more and more entities, plants, fungi, even rocks. So seems to be this tendency of those beliefs that change. Attributions of conscious awareness seem to increase.
So when you say their conscious awareness of these things like rocks, what you're really saying is they start to feel that these inanimate objects or even animals have human-like feelings.
Yeah, mental qualities.
Yeah. And so now it's like, oh, I love my rock. He's so sweet. And they, and before it was just a stone you stepped over and took no notice of.
Yeah. And to be fair, I mean, the change with rocks is smaller than the change with, say, plants.
Yeah. Or even animals. Or
animals, exactly.
Right. So why is that even important? I mean, kids feel that way. And when we're adults, we stop using magical thinking. When we're children, we're implored to use magical thinking. When we get older, we're supposed to abandon magical thinking. And what we're really talking about is magical thinking, right?
Well, so I'd push back on that a little bit. The point about like when we're adults, we abandon. I mean, so we being people who live in the Western, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic societies are actually very, very unusual in terms of the history of the world, in terms of the kinds of beliefs people have. I mean, these so-called animistic beliefs that, the world has intention, things that we'd call inanimate have mental qualities, are actually more common probably than our worldview. And so, yeah, I think in our society, it is kind of encouraged to, let go of some of these beliefs and with adulthood. But yeah, I mean, it's actually, we're kind of the odd ones in that, I think.
Interesting. Do you find that people who are devoutly religious have different outcomes when they use psychedelics than people who, I mean, I'm not an atheist, but I'm not a real big believer in, the big man up there and heaven and hell and all that. Even though I was raised Catholic and was an altar boy at a very young age, I don't buy any of it. It just doesn't make any sense to me. But do you feel that people who are more willing to engage in magical thought, especially religion, tend to have different outcomes from psychedelics?
Yeah, it's a very difficult question. The short answer is I don't really know. I mean, with the religion topic in particular, I think that somebody's religious background can often change the content of what comes up. In other words, a Christian might be more likely to see Jesus, but whether that kind of changes the outcome is sort of a different and more difficult question, especially because there's so much variability between people, you know?
You know, it's funny. I was asked to go see a movie recently about whether there is actually a heaven.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't believe there is. I mean, I'm sorry. I don't want to insult anybody, but I'm not going to lie and try to be part of a group that I'm not. But the thing I found fascinating was all of the people who saw Jesus at the time of their death. When you listen to them describe Jesus, it's the Jesus that they've looked at in books and magazines their whole life. It wasn't the dark-skinned, nappy-haired Jesus that really was what Jesus looked like, which immediately disqualifies any belief in what they saw, because what they saw was something they were programmed to see. It's an image that they haven't had in their head. So it couldn't be Jesus. It was just the image they had in their head. Like if somebody was said, and I saw Jesus and he was a what we would consider a black man, then I'd be, oh, wow, wait a minute, because this is a white person who's been taught to think Jesus is white and looks a certain way. And then I'd say, well, now, wait a minute. Now maybe there's something else going on here. But as soon as they started describing Jesus, it was the bearded, fair skin, long hair, kind eyes. And that's the Jesus that we've been taught to believe what he looks like. So that's one of the reasons I kind of discount the whole life after death thing. But with that being said, can what we know about psychedelics, and we're just scratching the surface, I understand, can what we know about psychedelics explain any of the heightened awareness and precision consciousness that people experience when they're clinically dead, which is not dead, folks. So clinically dead is not dead, just for the record. But it's the lack of certain bodily indicators like pulse and so on that is so low that like you're not alive either. But with that being said, can what we know about psychedelics explain anything about near-death experiences, what people see in their heads and, you know, the light and all that sort of stuff?
It's a tricky question. I mean, so there certainly is something of it. There is such a thing as a near-death experience, and there is this narrative out there that DMT, which is a psychedelic that actually occurs in our brains in very minuscule quantities. There's a narrative out there, which I don't think is true, that kind of around the time of death, there's this massive flood of DMT, and that's what explains the sort of psychedelic type. And it kind of, these near-death experiences can be sort of psychedelic-like. So the thing is, though, it's very tempting to make an analogy between those two things. Just like I think, when psychedelics first came out in the Western world, people didn't know how do we make sense of this? I don't know, maybe it's schizophrenia. They made that analogy. That's what they were able to understand at the time. But now we have kind of more refined concepts, and actually we think of those things as being very, very separate. We don't think of the psychedelic experience as necessarily being psychosis in the way that, schizophrenia is. And I think it may be similar with the near-death thing. The words that are used to describe them can kind of like cling together and sound very similar, but I think the more you know, they'll start to pull apart, if that makes sense.
So let's see here. Sean Wasson says, he's always been afraid of not having control, so he's not tried LSD yet, but he does want to do so. Is it so? We were so reckless when we were kids. When I was 16 years old, I started tripping, and we tripped with friends, and we played hooky from school, and we did all sorts of inappropriate things that we shouldn't have been doing, and we should have been in school. But we didn't worry about a bad trip. Like, we all heard about people who had bad trips, but they were alive the next day and everything seemed to be okay. So in the modern therapeutic, less reckless approach to using psychedelics in a therapeutic environment, is it something that is always done with a, not a shaman, but someone who leads you through the trip and reminds you that you're safe and everything's okay? And do you have to do that?
Yeah. So a lot of the people that show up to these psychedelic studies are not people who would have done this on their own. And basically, it's kind of, they're coming because they're suffering in some way. That's already kind of a different.
Right.
And so we spend a lot of time before they get any drug, like hours and hours, getting to know them, building a sense of rapport and trust, preparing them for kind of how to, deal with the experience, which can be overwhelming and frightening and all kinds of stuff. And then during the experience itself, the people that, the two people, that the therapists or monitors or whatever you want to call them, who've been there, are present the entire time. They're present the entire day. And then afterwards, days and weeks afterwards, you kind of help the person process and unpack it. And so there's a massive amount of support kind of before, during, and after. And even then, people have sometimes very, very challenging, difficult experiences. Now, having a negative experience in that context is not necessarily a bad thing. A lot of times it can actually end up being beneficial or therapeutic. But the caveat is that there may be some processing that is required to turn something that is negative into something therapeutic. And it's a lot to kind of just expect people to do on their own.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think most people are fearful, as Sean says,
frankly, rightfully so. I mean, there is a lot to be, that they are not to be trifled with, I think.
Right. So talking about your study, so a lot of the subject in your study had actually had this experience up to 8 years before the survey, right?
Yeah. Did
you see any correlation between, let's say, gender and effects of the experience as far as consciousness goes? Were women more likely to assign feelings to, something else than men, or any of those conclusions?
No, we did not. We looked. We did not see that there was a effect of gender. We did not even see that there was an effect of the different drugs people used or other kind of demographic stuff.
Did these people have this experience one time and one time only, or some of them, casual users of psychedelics?
Yeah. So this study in particular was specifically looking at single experiences, and so I should also say that, even if we restrict this to people who only had one experience in their entire life, we get the same results. So yeah, we are kind of specifically looking for whether or not a single experience does it, but I'm sure that kind of more experiences can kind of contribute over time to a similar thing.
Well, I guess what I'm wondering is it a dose dependent response? So in other words, if I've tripped once, I feel, empathetic towards things I didn't feel before. I feel sorry for bugs and stuff like that, which, by the way, when I was a young father, there was a spider in the house, and I didn't want to kill it. I wanted to bring it out of the house. So my daughter Taylor was probably about 4 years old at the time, and she was asking me why are you taking that bug out? Why don't you just step on it like mom does? And I says, well, how do I know that that's not the daddy bug and all the kids are waiting for him to come home from work today? And she looked at me, and that had an impact on how she looked at bugs after that. But it really is like, I don't feel somehow to be superior to anything else on the planet just because I'm human, and so I wonder if that is part of the experience from the LSD that I did.
So I don't know why, but that is a common, like, connectedness to nature, specifically nature.
Yeah.
And the kind of other life forms seems to be a theme across, different types of psychedelic experiences. So you're certainly not alone in that sort of not only experience, but kind of like what has happened afterwards.
And when I was young, the favorite thing to do was to do acid and go to Forest Park in Queens. And If it was a beautiful sunny day, it was just magnificent. I mean, just watching the shadows change would, absorb you for an hour. You like just looking at the trees and the sunlight changing and stuff. But yeah, we always sought out like, oh, it's a beautiful day. Let's trip and go to the park. That was like the thing, to be out in nature. That was the closest we could be in nature in Queens, New York, obviously. So that's interesting that you say that. Eric Swanee says, I always get a warm feeling in my brain stem and tense muscles while using psilocybin. Is this common?
I don't know specifically about your brainstem, but certainly kind of warmth and cold, even alternating experiences is pretty common. And yeah, many people do get tense muscles.
Explain synesthesia for the audience. Everybody who's tripped has experienced it in one way or the other. Why is the brain doing this? Why are you all of a sudden able to smell colors?
Yeah, synesthesia is basically the blending of senses. So this is a thing that your brain clearly has the capacity to do. Some people walk around with synesthesia. It's sort of a normal variant of human experience. It's not pathological, and yet most people do not have synesthetic experiences where they might hear sounds or see colors or whatnot, and yet these are really not uncommon under psychedelics. So yeah, I mean, it may be that psychedelics are allowing kind of different sensory areas that don't normally kind of separate from each other to communicate. That could be why people may develop synesthesia during that experience. But nobody, I don't think anyone's specifically looked at that.
I told you off the air, but I've talked about this numerous times on the show over the years, that I met Timothy Leary in Las Vegas as a young man. I attended a seminar. No one showed up. So it became a very intimate group of 15 people listening to him and then talking to him directly. And he told me back then something that apparently we've just discovered some years ago, maybe 5, 6, 7 years ago, that psilocybin, LSD, peyote, all of these psychedelic drugs have the ability to allow the brain, different areas of the brain, which all typically communicate through an area of the brain at the top of the brain stem called the corpus callosum. Am I saying that right?
The corpus callosum, yeah.
Callosum, which acts as a clearinghouse, sort of a traffic cop, so that stuff from this area of the brain and stuff from this area of the brain can communicate together, but only appropriately, as they're supposed to. And that LSD allows the areas of the brain to communicate directly with each other. And over time, those connections become long-term. They become actual collateral changes in the brain, which would help explain synesthesia, why the part of the brain responsible for olfactory senses and the part of the brain responsible for hearing communicate directly, and all of a sudden I can hear the color blue, and like that's a simple, easy way to say that that's what's happening. But with that being said, the long-term changes that you see when using psychedelics as a therapeutic, say for addiction or even depression, is this evidence of those permanent connections, like working around the ways they used to communicate and now communicating together and bypassing the broken part of the disk drive, or so to speak?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of the crux of, I mean, why should a single experience on a Tuesday retain any kind of meaning or benefit years and years later? That's for me is the kind of most important thing that needs to be answered. Why is there staying power for these? And one of the things one of the lines of research that I find most interesting is actually some of the neuroplasticity stuff in rodents. So rodents, for example, have, I mean, we do too, but these critical windows in which there's a certain period in youth where you are able to learn something in a certain way, more open to learning from your environment. That window then closes. Because you're as a child, even a rodent child, you're supposed to take your childhood to learn things, learn how to get around the world. Once you learn it, it's actually better for you to rely on useful habits. And so one of the lines of research that seems to be emerging is that psychedelics can sort of reopen these windows, and it allows people to kind of learn. Sorry, I should say not people, but like rodents to kind of learn maybe in a way that they did when they were younger. And so that kind of thing could explain why there's staying power. It may be that psychedelics open a window in which things that are learned during that period of time, and it's not just during the experience, it persists afterwards for some time. Those things may stick better. And yet that's context dependent. It's not just that everything is kind of wide open. It kind of depends on what you do with that. That I think is, that's all very speculative, but that I think might kind of get more towards explaining why these experiences stick. And it's not just the experience, it's what happens afterwards too.
As well. Yeah. All right, let's do this. Let's take a quick commercial break. I have more questions, and we'll look like the audience has questions. We're talking today with Dr. Sandeep Nayak. He is with Johns Hopkins, and they just published an interesting study about psychedelics and consciousness. We'll be right back with more Superhuman Radio. Stay tuned. Most people have heard of phytoestrogens, but did you know there are beneficial phytoandrogens? The top source of these is pine pollen. It even contains trace amounts of testosterone and DHEA. If you're looking for a 100% natural testosterone booster, this is worth trying. Lots of men love it, and it even works for women. Lost Empire Herbs offers the highest quality, wild-harvested, non-irradiated pine pollen backed by a 365-day money-back guarantee. It works for you, or you don't have to pay for it with nothing to send back. Go to shrnetwork.biz/Lost Empire. Use code SHR. Get 15% off your order today. If you've listened to this show for any length of time, you know that I have struggled to give up coffee for years. Coffee has destroyed my gut and it's impaired my health. Well, I haven't had coffee in months thanks to a product called Magic Mind. Magic Mind is the first nootropic blend I actually feel working. One shot and I'm good all day long. My memory is crystal clear and I'm able to function and have great focus without coffee or caffeine for that matter. If you want to try a product that really works, if you're like me and you want to give up coffee forever, or you just need something occasionally that will help you lift the brain fog, Magic Mind is your product. I promise you that this product you will feel when you use it. Go to shrnetwork.biz/Magic Mind, all one word, and use the code SHR for a whopping 20% off your first order. C60, also known as Buckminster fullerene, is the most powerful, most versatile antioxidant in the world. It's been shown in studies to double the lifespan of rodents. We all know the importance of taking antioxidants to slow aging, reduce inflammation, and improve mitochondrial function and energy production. But there are literally hundreds of antioxidants that would cost you thousands of dollars to take every day. I take one. I take C60 from C360 Health. Revive and Rejuvenate are two blends that harness the power of C60. Don't waste another minute. Go to shrnetwork.biz/revive and use the code SHR for 15% off and free shipping inside the United States today.
Dogs should be powered by fat and protein, not carbs. That's why Visionary Pet makes low-carb, ketogenic dog food for dogs of all breeds and life stages. From kibble to freeze-dried and even low-carb treats, all Visionary Pet recipes are very low-carb, ketogenic, and made with 100% real meat protein. Shop now and use code SHR for 20% off your first order today. Your dog deserves the lifelong benefits of optimal nutrition. Make the switch to Visionary and see why smart dogs eat low carb.
Are you 35 or older? Every year after puberty, your growth hormone decreases sometimes by 50% by the age of 35, and it only keeps going down from there. This affects everything from making it harder to recover from workouts, sleep, and a general loss of a sense of well-being. It also affects your ability to get and stay lean. BioPro Plus is the first of its kind, 100% non-synthetic alternative to prescription synthetic growth hormone treatments. All the benefits without any of the needles or side effects and 100% safe. Previously only available through doctors, you can go to shrnetwork.biz/biopro, that's BIOPRO, and use code SHR30 for $30 off today. You may be wondering why you're experiencing performance issues in the bedroom, but you're not alone. Over 30 million men experience a form of erectile dysfunction, and to many, it can feel defeating. Maybe you've tried pills, diets, exercise, but finally there's a proven solution. Meet Eddie, a discreet device designed to help men strengthen and maintain their erections. Pills can be costly and result in debilitating side effects, so I checked out Eddie by Giddy at shrnetwork.biz/Eddie and found out that over 95% of men experience positive results wearing Eddie, according to a 2021 clinical trial. This product simply works and is easy to use. Sign up for a subscription at shrnetwork.biz/Eddie and save $20 on your first device with promo code SUPER20 with free device resizes and 60-day guarantee. You'll be glad you tried it. Treat ED with Eddie at shrnetwork.biz/Eddie. That's EDDIE.
This is the Superhuman Channel, where brawn and brains finally meet.
Hey, welcome back. So, getting back on the topic of psychedelics for a moment, is there any evidence that psychedelics can aid in neuromuscular disorders? I mean, we know a lot about perception and consciousness and depression and all these things that are really more about the way you think and feel and perceive the world. Is there any evidence that the trajectory of neuroplasticity can also be leveraged if you're trying to, let's say, help somebody with Parkinson's disease?
Yeah, so you're really anticipating the direction of the field here. I mean, yeah, any number. So stroke, you have a stroke. Those dead brain cells aren't going to grow back. And the way that people recover from a stroke is not that they magically regenerate dead tissue, but the remaining brain kind of relearns how to operate. And so there is a limit to that, though. And so that is something that there are going to be studies on that, I think, in the near future. What can psychedelics aid in the recovery of movement after a stroke, or even other things like language? But again, it's going to probably depend on how you use it, what you do with it.
Do psychedelics only affect central nervous system? What about peripheral nervous system? Do we see any changes peripheral nervous system wise when people have had therapeutic uses of psychedelics?
That's a good question. I mean, so most serotonin neurons are in the gut, and psychedelics certainly can affect the gut. And as far as kind of like the rest of the peripheral nervous system, I actually don't know. Not to my knowledge, but just to be honest, I actually don't know.
So this is an interesting observation from Joseph Lanigan. He says, "I feel jacked AF." Everybody knows what that means. It's a family-friendly show. And leaner during and post tripping. Are there any metabolic changes that are affected? I mean, no one wants to eat when they're tripping. I mean, I never did. I never got hungry. And subsequently, I usually fast for 2 or 3 days at a time before fasting was even popular in the 70s, because no one wanted to eat when you were tripping. But are there any metabolic changes that occur?
So, yeah, I mean, there are lots and lots of gut. Psychedelics in general are probably affecting neurons in the gut during the experience, but to my knowledge, there aren't really significant metabolic changes otherwise.
And this is interesting because I'm going to try to pronounce this right. Baranati, who is watching on YouTube, says, "Why does the stomach react as it does to psychedelics?" So a lot of people do complain. It depends on the psychedelic, right? Like LSD, I never got nauseous from, but I have gotten nauseous from large doses of mushrooms, and it's just preliminary. You feel nausea as you're starting to feel the trip come on. But is there a direct effect on the stomach by psychedelics, and is it all psychedelics or just certain ones?
Certain ones are certainly more prone to causing nausea. I mean, ayahuasca often causes, maybe even for most people, nausea and vomiting.
Yeah.
But yeah, mushrooms are, in general, I mean, if you eat a bunch of dried shiitake, that's also actually going to be irritating on its own.
Right.
and yet it is the drug itself. So even we use synthetic psilocybin, it's not derived from mushrooms, it's just the molecule, and large fraction of people do get nausea. It's probably less than it from mushrooms. So I think when it comes to mushrooms, it's probably a combination of the mushroom itself, the material being irritating to the gut, but also, yeah, there are just tons and tons of serotonin neurons in the gut. And in the same way that, psychedelics can perturb various aspects of the function of the mind, it can probably also perturb. It actually takes a lot for the gut to function appropriately. There's a lot of coordinated activity in moving food from one part to the other, and you kind of get in there and mess it up. That can just cause nausea, I think.
Yeah, interesting. I'm going to put this other question up, but I'm going to go ahead and say ahead of time that the doctor is not capable of telling you this. How does one properly determine how much of a dose of mushrooms is microdose for the body? First of all, when you're dealing with natural things like mushrooms, I mean, just like wine crops vary from year to year, the concentration of psilocybin in one batch of mushrooms, because they were where they were grown and processed, could be very, very different than another. So, there's really no way to make a recommendation. Now, obviously, as you point out, Dr. Nayak, you're using a synthetic psilocybin, so you can tell, we're giving this person 300 micrograms of this, but it's virtually impossible to do the same thing with the natural mushrooms, right?
Yeah, I mean, forget about between batches. Even mushrooms in the same batch can have a tenfold variation in how much psilocybin they have, so it can be very unpredictable. I'm not advocating the use of psilocybin mushrooms, though.
No, we know that, and we want to make sure that everybody understands that. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about a study that was conducted in a controlled environment, or was not in a controlled environment, but they didn't deliver the drugs to the people to use. And should one be concerned about mold on mushrooms? I've heard that you will feel mushrooms more so if you make them into a tea than if you take them orally. And I guess if boiling water would kill any potential mold, but let's face it, the mushroom itself is mold. So I don't know. You can't really, that's hard to answer. So getting back to the topic at hand, what other aspects of consciousness appear to be altered when someone has tripped once, dozen times in their life, besides assigning, certain characteristics to non-human, let's say, things? What other changes do you notice? Empathy, for instance, do people become more empathetic, or?
So, I mean, in the realm of, if we want to stick with the realm of belief for a second, it seems that this is the thing that's remarkable to me, is that there is any kind of direction at all. Why, some people, they sort of view psychedelics as being these non-specific, lubricants of the brain, where it just makes everything kind of flexible and pliable, and it can kind of get pushed around in whatever direction. And yet, kind of, when we look at the belief data, it sort of seems that there is actually a clear direction that beliefs tend to move. And it's sort of in a non-materialist direction, anti-materialist direction. And so why that should be, I don't really know. But again, that is kind of the norm of the world. We are the odd ones when it comes to those sorts of beliefs. But yeah, otherwise, I mean, there can be very persistent increases in sense of well-being. There can be sort of, what we would call mindfulness can increase, just the way that people view their experience and kind of go about moment to moment. And certainly there are things that people might learn during a psychedelic experience that they could retain.
During the growing years of Silicon Valley, the big secret weapon amongst some of these people requiring original thought to see the future of their industry was microdosing. Very, very low doses. Supposedly, you can't even feel the dose. It's that small. And that, as far as LSD goes, I think 20 or 30 micrograms of LSD as opposed to 250 and above, which will get you to trip. And even with psilocybin mushrooms, I think that a lot of people feel that the common knowledge is about 150 micrograms of psilocybin, of mushrooms. Again, these are all purported to, you don't even know, you don't feel anything, which makes a lot of people go, then why am I using this? Is there any value, you think, to this microdosing approach that's become popularized amongst the tech industry? Or do you have to trip? Just, have, even if it's just one time, do you have to trip?
So one thing I can say is that when microdosing has been studied in controlled conditions, in other words, you have something to compare it to, it doesn't seem to do a ton. Now, that doesn't mean that it's not doing something or that it can't be useful, but it's kind of hard to show that it's doing something useful. And so that is not the case with these macro doses. It's not this subtle thing that maybe not. And so I personally, my opinion is on microdosing, I'm uncertain. I would guess that depending on how it's used, it may end up having some use, but when you actually compare it to something like a placebo, it does not, it's pretty hard to show that it's doing anything different.
And I've always suspected that, because if you're not doing a dose large enough to alter your perception, then I just can't believe that anything. And I read a book some years ago, and the title of the book was akin to an astronaut and psychedelics. I forget. I'm sorry, I can't remember it. It was
Psychedelic Explorer's Guide.
What was it called? Maybe that was maybe the Psychedelic Explorer's Guide. That was one of them, but there was another one, and I know that it was like something not Juggernaut, but
Psychonaut.
Psychonaut or something like that. Yeah, and that book made the argument that all of this microdosing stuff is about nothing, and that if unless you feel it. Now, there's all different degrees of feeling it. Like, I like to do a half a gram of mushrooms because I feel it, but I don't trip. But I just have this, I'm on the verge of feeling like I want to smile about everything. I'm on the verge of having this kind of easy to get very focused. In fact, I tend to meditate for very long periods of time when I feel this way. It's very easy for me to focus on a mantra and kind of just disappear into my head. But I feel it. I know I've taken something. It's not this amount that I think, well, I think it's working. I'm not sure. I've always been a big believer that if you don't feel it, it's really not doing anything. That's just my own personal opinion. That's all.
The flip side, though, is that, I mean, there are drugs that work on the mind and have pretty significant effects on the mind that you don't necessarily feel. Like antidepressants, people don't necessarily feel the effect of an antidepressant, but it could still.
I would actually argue that it's the lack of feeling anything that is the signature of an SSRI. I know a lot of people who've gone on SSRIs and literally have become zombies over their life. I mean, they're not excited about anything. They're not sad about anything. They're just kind of like just going through life. But I get it. There are a lot of things that don't put forth a lot of evidence that they're doing their job. And with psychedelics like psilocybin and LSD, since they seem to be characterized by their importance in increasing BDNF, does LSD work better than psilocybin, for instance, because it's chemical, it's stronger, or are they pretty much the same as far as upregulating BDNF?
I don't specifically know about BDNF, but I mean, all psychedelics, if you zoom out, if you zoom way out, they're much more similar than they are different. They all work on a very specific receptor of serotonin, the 2A receptor. If you block that receptor, nothing happens psychedelic. And so, yeah, there are differences between these drugs. Many of them are kind of subtle, but a lot of them are in terms of how long they act. But all of these like subtle differences between drugs. I think I mean, LSD and psilocybin are actually kind of more similar than they are different. The big kind of divide in my mind is phenethylamines. So that would be drugs like mescaline, which are understudied, and they do actually seem to be quite different in some ways in terms of their effects, and may actually have different, I'm not going to say better, but different properties that could be useful in different ways.
Interesting. I want to take a quick commercial break. I've got a lot more questions. We have other questions from the audience. Stay tuned. We'll be right back with more Superhuman Radio. More than 240 million Americans take supplements daily in pill form, but poor nutrient absorption means the promised results are rarely achieved. Healthy Cell uses a clinically proven patent-pending gel delivery system that increases absorption by 165% over pill form. Go to shrnetwork.biz/healthycell. That's HEALTHYCELL today and use the code SHR to save 20% off your purchase of Healthy Cell supplements.
New Mass Pro Synthogen X2 just upped its own legendary game. To distance itself even further from the rest of the pack, Synthogen X2 now has double the key active ingredients. If you've ever wondered what steroid-like recovery feels like, Synthogen X2 delivers. See why others compare it favorably to powerful bodybuilding drugs at synthogen.com. Mass Pro Synthogen. When you train with it, you'll gain with it.
I would easily say that I am the hugest proponent you will ever meet to doing anything that will improve the quality of my sleep. And that's because sleep is linked to just about every metabolic disorder we see in our population today. One of the easiest things you can do to improve the quality of your sleep is to get a pillow that can be shaped into the exact form factor that allows you to get your best night's sleep. And that is My Pillow. I've been sleeping with My Pillow for a few years now, and I can tell you that when I have to travel and stay in hotels, I don't get a good night's sleep because I don't have My Pillow with me. Right now, you can save up to 60% off of everything offered to improve the quality of your sleep at shrnetwork.biz/mypillow when you use the code SHR. Or you can call toll-free 800-889-4938. And remember to use code SHR to save up to 60% off of everything at their website. Being superhuman means being conscientious about the choices we make. White Oak Pastures is superhuman when it comes to raising livestock. They're committed to animal welfare, land regeneration, and rural revival. They responsibly manage the entire process from the pasture to your doorstep. High quality, pasture raised, great tasting meat from a farm you can trust. Full nose to tail selections. They even have options for your pet. Go to shrnetwork.biz/white oak and use the code superhuman to save 10% off your entire first order. If you'd like a shortcut to better sleep, more energy, and calmer, more stable moods, then you should make sure you're supplementing with magnesium daily. Let me tell you why. About 75% of people are magnesium deficient. This deficiency can lead to higher levels of anxiety, irritability, trouble sleeping, and low energy. It can even contribute to foot and leg cramps while you sleep. Magnesium Breakthrough by Bioptimizers is the single best magnesium supplement in the world. Simply take 2 capsules before you go to bed, and you'll be amazed by the improvements in your mood and energy levels and how much more rested you feel when you wake up. I take Magnesium Breakthrough every night, and I sleep better because I use it. Go to magbreakthrough.com/SHR and use the code SHR10 during checkout to save 10% off and get free shipping. Check it out. Plant medicine has become all the rage for mental optimization. Now there's an ancient plant medicine rapidly growing in popularity that experts believe might just be the alcohol of the future. It's called True Kava. Kava is a natural food-grade elixir that has been used for over 3,000 years by South Pacific Islanders as safe, non-addictive alternative to drugs and alcohol. By naturally boosting the brain's main feel-good chemicals, dopamine, serotonin, and GABA, Kava provides you with both increased relaxation and mental clarity at the same time. True Kava is a new form of stabilized full-spectrum traditional kava that is third-party lab tested for quality and safety. Go to shrnetwork.biz/true kava, and that's TRUKAVA, all one word, and use code SHR for 25% off today.
This is the Superhuman Channel, where we use oxygen for the power of good.
Welcome back. We're talking to Dr. Sandeep Nayak. We're talking about psychedelics and consciousness and all sorts of stuff related to psychedelics. So, are there a group of people that no matter how large a dose they take, they don't respond to psychedelics? And if so, is that indicative of a future problem in their brain?
So there are anecdotally people who just do not seem to have effects to actually, I shouldn't even say anecdotally. We've seen those people in our trials And of the ones that I can think of, I mean, they did respond to higher doses. So I don't know that there's anybody that's immune to the effects of psychedelics, but there are, for reasons that are not all that clear, some people who regular dose does not seem to cause the same effects. There are also medications that do this too, like SSRIs, for example, seem to suppress psychedelic effects to the point that some people who are on SSRIs or even recently stopped SSRIs do not get much in the way of psychedelic effects.
That's fascinating. I've always wondered from the standpoint of like, maybe there's a defect in the brain. It could be acquired. It could be something that happened from birth. And as a result, they don't respond to psychedelics at all because, as you talk about, the serotonin receptor, maybe they have some sort of malfunction. And I just thought that, oh, wow, if somebody takes a large dose of LSD, maybe 500 micrograms, and goes, yeah, I don't feel nothing. And like, oh my God, you have this problem. It's going to show up later on in life. Like somehow the inability to respond to psychedelics is predictive of some future dysfunction. I don't know, ALS or anything. I just didn't know if there was any proof of that.
Yeah, probably not. I mean, the receptors that psychedelics act on are so widely distributed throughout the brain, the cortex. And yeah, I mean, if you're on an SSRI, you're flooding all those, maybe that would block the effects. But I don't know of a kind of a normal disorder that would lead to people not experiencing psychedelic effects. And again, even these people who don't, I mean, it's quite likely that they might on a higher dose or something like that. There is also a possibility that some of that could be psychological as well. I mean, it does, even in our trials, we do sometimes see people are able to sort of block some of the effects. That only goes so far, but
yeah,
I don't know.
As I shared with you and with my audience, I took large doses of LSD frequently in high school, and probably into the time I was about 20, 21. Can you take too much? Like I've heard stories about, we're talking about real MDMA, not street MDMA, which could be a variety of recreational drugs mixed together. But I've heard stories about people taking very large doses of MDMA and the brain being so overwhelmed by serotonin that when they come down, they are forever depressed because the sensitivity to serotonin has been altered, so to speak. And now the new normal for them is like where it was when they were using the drug. So they never feel good again. Can you take too much of a psychedelic?
So yeah, I can share my thoughts on this. I mean, MDMA in particular is a very different drug than things like LSD or psilocybin or mescaline. And so MDMA, for sure, there is a certain dose at which it becomes toxic. By dose, I mean over time, repeated doses.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the argument, though, and this has been shown in animals, it's kind of less clear in humans, but the question is like, okay, but are those doses that people are actually taking? If you give massive doses to an animal, of course, you can show some dysfunction. And I think that the answer is probably yes. Kind of towards the upper end of the amount of MDMA people take, I think it probably does cause long-term serotonin dysfunction. But it's a matter of how much and the dose. But
psychedelics, can you have this problem with psychedelics? Like all the doses, the big doses I did all those years ago, have they altered I do have to take larger doses now to feel it. So I guess it has altered it. Yeah.
I wonder what would happen though if you stopped taking it for several months.
I do. I don't do it religiously ever, but I go through spurts where I take off for a while just because I just don't feel like using it.
I see. But yeah, I mean, compared to MDMA, I mean, they're just essentially non-toxic. Like they don't cause damage. They may cause changes in function, but yeah, I mean, MDMA compared to drugs like psilocybin is much, much, much more toxic. I'm not saying it's very toxic, but just in comparison.
Yeah. So do you know the story about the Native Americans followed the buffalo and ate the psilocybin that was left behind to sprout out of their stool, and that over this period of time, when they started to engage in eating these mushrooms, their brains got bigger? Have you ever heard any of that?
I've heard it. The version I've heard is kind of the stoned ape.
Okay, yes. Tell me about it. Tell the audience.
The stoned ape theory. So it's way further back than Native Americans. It's kind of pre-humans, basically. The stoned ape theory is that our primate ancestors, so not quite Homo sapiens, who did not have the level of intelligence that we have, essentially gained powers by cognitive abilities by eating psychedelic mushrooms. And people kind of take that to various degrees. Oh, it's responsible for our capacity for consciousness. It's responsible for our intelligence, our ability to use language. To me, frankly, it's utter nonsense.
Okay.
Like, there's not any clear, even if our ancestors did eat psilocybin mushrooms, there's not a clear way that could cause changes that would propagate down. It's got to affect the genes somehow.
But so you don't think there's a potential for transgenerational epigenetic effects because of the introduction and exposure to psychedelics?
I certainly think there could be transgenerational epigenetic effects, but the kinds of things that we're talking about are like the massive changes that lead to explosion in brain size, lead to just language, right? I mean that's much more substantial than epigenetics is kind of making changes on top of the genome. This is the genome itself has to change in order to allow those kinds of human capacities.
Because one of the things that a lot of scientists have missed out on when the discussion switches to epigenetics is we think of epigenetics as making changes to the expression of genes in such a way that it confers either the potential for illness or the potential for health. We talk about epigenetic changes that go through the germline. Like we did a show some years ago about populations that have actually sustained and lived through a famine, like Ireland, like Russia, and they have epigenetic changes that predispose them to alcoholism and depression. But the other thing that epigenetics does is it passes along basic learning. The reason a baby deer knows to fear a human is because of epigenetic influences in the transference of information. This was shown in a study where they took male rodents and did a Pavlovian experiment with them. With every time they smelled black cherry, they gave them a shock. And they did this for some period of time till the rodents immediately became anxiety-ridden as soon as they smelled black cherry because they knew the shock was coming. And then they put them back into cages with just general populations of rodents and had them mate, and then took the babies. And as soon as the babies smelled black cherry, they became frantic and afraid. And so the purpose of that study was to show how what we learn is passed along. And they showed that it was an epigenetic change in the offspring. It was transgenerational. It was in the germline of the semen, and it was transferred to the. So if we learn something from our trip, or it alters our perception. It alters our perception. We're almost over. It alters our perception of life in the form of knowledge and experiences that could be passed along to our offspring. So I think that I bet you we're going to find out that through epigenetics, the experiences in LSD are passed along to transgenerationally to future offspring.
Could be possible, though. I will say it. I think there's a limit to that.
What do you mean by a limit to that?
Epigenetics only goes so far, and I question whether kind of like very, very, especially the stoned ape kind, changes are actually possible to.
Well, I don't believe the stoned ape, because if you really look at evolution, so there was Australopithecus gracile and Australopithecus robustus. Gracile was also known as Africanus, and robustus continued to be a vegan and had a fairly short lifespan, and gracile or Africanus started to eat bone marrow and stuff that they found. And Dr. Leslie Aiello wrote profoundly about this. She was the head of the Wenner-Gren Foundation in New York, in Manhattan, the anthropological organization that studies life and all that. And she showed that the brains got bigger and the guts got smaller when we started to include meat and animal flesh in our diet. And so that was really what changed our brains. It was less energy and machinery needed to absorb nutrients from eating twigs all day long versus getting more nutrition in fewer meals. And so the brain got bigger. But what I can see happening is it with like native people that roam who used ayahuasca and things like that, that those experiences could have altered the way they approached problems. The original thought theory that Timothy Leary talked about. So I do see like maybe, learning to make tools and stuff like that being something. But the whole idea that they ate mushrooms and they went from those, dumb animals to brilliant humans or Homo sapiens, I don't buy that either. Because there's a lot of time in between there.
Yeah, but certainly culture. I mean, it can have massive influence on culture that can be propagated down.
And if you look at Dr. Daniel Lieberman, who's been on the show twice, he authored the book, The Story of the Human Body. Great book, Harvard.
This is The Runner.
What's that?
The Runner.
Yeah.
I've read that book, one of his books.
So he wrote the book, The Story of the Human Body, and to talk about the evolution of the human. And he points out that culture drives evolution. Nothing drives evolution like culture. Women choose men that they believe will convey to their offspring the qualities needed for life at that moment, and culture plays a big influence on that. So it's really funny, but yeah, you're right.
Yeah.
Did we miss anything about the study that we could cover before I pull the plug?
I guess, one thing is we didn't quite talk about it, but the magnitude of the change was related to the extent to which people had mystical experiences. So it wasn't just the qualities of the experience itself seemed to matter in how much those beliefs changed, which, is not too surprising, but it's still interesting to kind of see that sort of, marked out empirically.
And that makes sense to go full circle to what we were talking about before, the energizing of emotion attaching itself to the event, that psychedelics, because psychedelics kind of give everything that sense of awe, like, oh man, that's so, oh wow, you just feel things so much deeper, and the everything is energized and bonded to emotion. So that makes a lot of sense that the greater awestruck they are from the trip, the more profound the effects were long term. That does make a lot of sense.
Yep.
You're in a fascinating area of science right now. How did you get in here?
Luck. This is something that I always found interesting, wanted to do. I entered the field of psychiatry. It was at Hopkins, which is, where they do this work. And I happened to be here right as they were opening the center. Maybe had I come a few years earlier or something like that, but I just happened to be in the right place at the right time, and I had the interest.
Did you grow up in the United States?
Yeah, born in New York, grew up in Georgia.
What part of New York?
Queens.
Oh yeah, where? I lived in Richmond Hill, South Ozone Park for a while, but I'm originally from Bed-Stuy, Brooklyn.
I see. Yeah, I was a kid. I think it was Forest Hills.
Oh yeah, Forest Hill's very nice. Yeah, they have that big tennis tournament every year up there in Forest Hills, and Forest Hills was where Forest Park was. That I told you I used to go and hang out. That's Forest Park. Yeah. Yeah, you're talking about, you're more like on Austin. I want to say Austin Avenue was in Forest Hills. It's a beautiful area, Forest Hills. Beautiful.
Yeah, I was like 3 years old though.
Did you have friends in high school and in college that tripped?
In college, yeah, college, yes, it was kind of widespread in college. In high school, there was not really any of that to speak of.
Yeah. Well, this is fascinating, and I think that the area that you're in right now is going to provide a lot of really beneficial things for people.
Hopefully so.
Yeah, I think you're in the right place. Listen, Sandeep, thank you so much for making time to come on the show today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It was my pleasure.
Take care.
Yep, take care.
And that's it for today's show, folks. We do have a show tomorrow, and then the weekend is here, and I'm so glad to be off. But please share the show. You never know who you're going to help if you share the show. And we'll see you tomorrow with more Superhuman Radio. And thank you for being here today. Remember those rectangular toaster pastries you used to love when you were a kid? Well, Legendary Foods has just...